in this episode.
Perhaps one way of portraying the differences is that in Kant, you have a certain way of trying to summarize the fundamental structures of experience. So there's a certain finite set of categories with which we come to comprehend the world. You don't find anything similar in Husserl. There's no attempt of trying to, deduce a certain finite list. Rather, I think Husserl has a much less systematic, but at the same time a much more fluid or dynamic understanding of what are ultimately the transcendental structures, which is also the reason why I think Husserl is eventually able to include something like historicity, sociality into his transcendental analysis. And I think in making that move, I think he kind of points the way towards 20th century philosophy and away from a more kind of strict or restricted conception of what transcendental philosophy is that we find in Kant.
Phenomenology is the rigorous study of lived conscious experience. Its founder Edmund Husserl was largely overshadowed by Martin Heidegger, a giant of 20th century philosophy who surpassed him despite being the initiator of the science of phenomenology. It was mistakenly believed that Husserl could not free himself from the framework of a classical metaphysics of subjectivity and consequently remained Cartesian, idealistic, and solipsistic. But perhaps this mischaracterization isn't the case anymore. Thanks to the work of modern philosophers such as Dan Zahavi, who has been central in renewing and expanding Husserlian phenomenology for a 21st century audience with books like Husserl's Phenomenology, which now could be considered a classic text. Dan Zahavi is professor of philosophy at the University of Copenhagen and director of the Center for Subjectivity Research. He's one of the preeminent living phenomenological philosophers known for his work in phenomenology, selfhood, and the philosophy of mind. In this episode, we discuss subjectivity and intersubjectivity, Husserl's phenomenology, and phenomenological contributions to social ontology, which I hope you will find insightful after this quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode. As I was saying before, Professor Zahavi, thanks so much for agreeing to this. Yeah, I've actually, I've got to say, I'm a big fan of your work. Like, I've learned so much. I mean, this is probably one of the best Husserl books I've read in my life, honestly. And in fact, all I know about Husserl, because I didn't really read him. I read a bit of the Crisis, but apart from that, it's been through your work. So thanks so much. But now on the note, I thought it'll be a bit of a fun place to start. Perhaps one might say a bit of a biographical note even for you. Yeah, I mean, you are one of the preeminent phenomenological philosophers, and when people think phenomenology, I think a lot of people, certainly outside of like pure philosophy, think of a character like Heidegger or Sartre or Beauvoir or Merleau-Ponty. But in your case, a lot of your scholarship the efforts have gone towards introducing Husserl to a 21st century audience. So yeah, why did you pick to research specifically Husserl's phenomenology over more of the, let's call it, existential phenomenologists like Heidegger or Sartre or Merleau-Ponty, which, as I've mentioned in the questions, at least is a bit more in vogue outside of pure academic philosophy.
So I think it makes sense perhaps to distinguish, two sides to the question. So one is the more biographical, and when I was an undergraduate, I didn't really start with Husserl, but initially I had this dual interest on the one hand in Aristotle and on the other hand in Immanuel Kant. And at one point I had this revelation or disclosure that perhaps Husserl, when I was then at some point introduced to Husserl, that actually there was something in him that could bring these two traditions together. Now, of course, speaking of Kant and Aristotle, one might also very well think of Heidegger as somebody who were very much drawing on those two figures as well. But Husserl always had my interest, and when I decided to go to Germany to basically do my master thesis, I also went to visit and study with a very well-known Husserlian. And so, the moment you kind of start down a certain route, I guess it leads you certain ways. And after having been in Germany, I then decided to go to the Husserl archives in Leuven, and then, the trajectory was to some extent laid out. So that's the, very, very short kind of biographical piece. But of course, it's also important for me to emphasize that I have a very, I think, inclusive view on phenomenology, and I've always been opposed to the idea that you have to pick sides. That it's about defending one phenomenologist over another. I've always thought this is a very counterproductive kind of infight, and especially given that there are so many other people that might disagree with a phenomenological approach to philosophy. I think it's much more sensible to try to join forces, try to focus on what we share. People defending different, sides, aspects of phenomenology, try to emphasize what we share and try to strengthen that precisely in a kind of discussion or dialogue with other traditions. So this idea of making a big fuss out of talking of, say, the huge abyss that separates Husserlian phenomenology from later post-Husserlian phenomenologies. I not only do I think it's unproductive, but I'm also very much in disagreement with that way of depicting how the development of phenomenology actually occurred. And just one final thing about the notion of existential phenomenology. So there are, of course, a lot of different terms floating around. Descriptive phenomenology, hermeneutic phenomenology, pure phenomenology, transcendental phenomenology, existential phenomenology, phenomenology of the body. Again, I don't know how super helpful it is to carve out the tradition using these terms, because I think many of the figures, and especially also Husserl, he has parts of all of this already in his own work. And quite recently, an edited volume was published called The Existential Husserl, with contributions from a number of Husserlians highlighting the more existential themes in Husserl's phenomenology. So again, as Husserl scholarship has developed, I think it has also uncovered many dimensions, aspects of Husserl's philosophy that one might not have been familiar with or might not have anticipated if one had just stuck with the few volumes he published during his lifetime. And all these aspects are to a large extent, has been revealed as a result of the continuing publication of the text critical Husserl edition, which by now, encompasses 44 volumes. So there's tons of material there.
Yeah, so I understand that you say that you're not a fan of this cutting up of phenomenology, so to speak, or all of this grouping, and then, as you say, the post-Husserlian and whatnot. But if you could, let's say, for lack of a better term, devil's advocate, and again, I know that this question, one can't answer in an interview, or probably not even in a lecture. It probably warrants a whole book, really. But at a high level, what do you see, at least from a certain interpretation, the differences between Husserl's phenomenological project and then the post-Husserlians like Heidegger and then Merleau-Ponty and Sartre and so on?
But I mean, to some extent, it's also, I think, difficult to really view the post-Husserlians as if they constitute a monolith, because I mean, my own take on Husserl has always been to a large extent emphasize the continuation between him and Merleau-Ponty. I mean, so to some extent, I read Merleau-Ponty very much in a Husserlian way, and I also read Husserl to some extent very much as a Merleau-Pontian. So I think there are continuities there which might not necessarily appear if you then consider the relationship between Husserl and the late Heidegger, or Husserl and certain aspects of Sartre's philosophy. So again, post-Husserlians are not one thing, and I guess my own. So again, I mean, I am very much committed to a certain continuity story, but I would also say, and I mean, I would also say that even vis-a-vis people who want to emphasize some kind of rupture, that I really don't think it's possible to appreciate and understand the philosophical contributions of the post-Husserlians without a kind of in-depth familiarity with the Husserlian framework. I mean, I think there's so many notions, so many. Well, there's so much of the opening up of this philosophical perspective that we are indebted to Husserl for doing. So I think, I mean, we need to start with him. I mean, and of course, if people want to move on, that's all fine with me. But I mean, the idea that one can somehow dispense with, investigation of time consciousness, embodiment, intersubjectivity, intentionality, life work, that one can somehow dispense with all of that and go directly into the post-Husserlians, I think will leave one without the proper foundation.
Yes, I mean, if you could humor me for a moment here, I'm just curious. Like, do you think the reason Heidegger has this much of a pull, like all over, not just in philosophy, all the way from architecture and archaeology to artificial intelligence, is that just because of the way he writes, like his style? He's he almost writes a bit like a mystic sometimes, and whereas like Husserl, even though he is difficult to read, I wouldn't say like he is still a very clear writer. Like the little I read of him, he writes almost kind of like systematically even. Why is it a purely kind of a cultural phenomenon? Why Heidegger has this kind of pull outside of philosophy?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I mean, it's a good question. I think there are many different reasons. I mean, I think there are historical reasons in the sense that, I mean, given the political circumstances, I mean, there was kind of a clamp down basically on Husserlian phenomenology in Germany. I mean, so there was also, I mean, the way phenomenology was, there was a kind of a lost generation of Husserlian phenomenology in Germany. So, I mean, Heidegger was very much pushed after the war. There were specific reasons why the French picked up on Heidegger as an alternative to Sartre. So they're all, I mean, that side of the story. I also think, I mean, honestly, I mean, if you read Heidegger's lectures, I mean, they are fantastic. And I mean, I can understand why he, in the mid-20s, I mean, attracted people from all over Germany to come to attend those lectures, because he really had an oratory skill that Husserl definitely does not have. So that could also be an explanation. But I also think, I mean, honestly, I actually think that the situation has changed a bit for a number of reasons. I mean, I think, when I started out,
probably thanks to people like you, to be honest.
Yeah, well, perhaps. But again, I mean, when I started out in the mid 80s, I mean, Husserl was really not a major concern to a lot of people, including people doing phenomenology. And there was this idea that, well, at best, he's a stepping stone. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there has been a renaissance of Husserl interest, perhaps also due to my contribution and other people's contribution. So that's part of the story. But I also think we should not overlook the fact that that something has happened to Heidegger's popularity as well. Of course, due to the disclosure of the Black Notebooks. So he has also almost become a persona non grata. And I mean, in Germany these days, it's pretty difficult to actually teach courses on Heidegger. I can't really say exactly what the scene is in a more non-academic context. But I would say that, his trajectory, it's not like what it was 20 or 30 years ago. So I think, again, things are much more complicated or mixed up or messy now than they were a while back.
Indeed. I mean, I'd say all for the better, makes it more interesting, especially even like in this kind of like what I would call para-academic circles, for lack of a better term, which is like, it's not really particularly in the university, but like online philosophy communities and whatnot. There's a lot of interesting work going on, with Husserl, but even, as you say, Heidegger. Great. The other question on the note of kind of existential phenomenology, as Professor Zahavi. So in this other book of yours, which is more of an introductory text just to phenomenology in general, I want to discuss, I think it's chapter 6, where you dedicate a whole chapter to Merleau-Ponty's preface in the Phenomenology of Perception. So my question is, in fact, bipartite. Firstly, I mean, I think, I'm not exaggerating to say this, it's probably one of the most popular prefaces in modern philosophy that in that book. Firstly, can you just talk about why you decided in a book on phenomenology to dedicate a whole chapter just to a preface of a book? And secondly, what do you see the significance of that preface, especially this particular bit where Ponty, he asks, okay, what is phenomenology? And then he says, phenomenology is a study of essences, and according to it, all problems amount to finding definitions of essences. So these two kind of, can you speak to these two kind of parts of the question, please?
Well, so obviously, the reason why I devoted that chapter to the preface is because I think it's a really great preface. I think it's it's also a very, very perceptive reading of Husserl very early on. There has been this, discussion subsequently by a certain generation of Merleau-Pontians who in all kinds of ways were trying to distance themselves from Merleau-Ponty's very, I think, generous reading of Husserl, saying that ultimately the Husserl that Merleau-Ponty was discussing was an invention of his own because he couldn't face up to the fact that Husserl was nothing but an idealist, etc., etc. And I think this is all nonsense. I think Merleau-Ponty definitely had a much better grasp of what Husserl was up to than many of the subsequent Merleau-Pontians. I think, again, the situation has changed today, but if we're going back to texts in the 80s and 90s, that was very much the kind of received view. So I think Merleau-Ponty really got it right, and I think he was seeing also the kind of complexity of phenomenology. And in the preface, one of the things he does is to say, well, there are kind of conflicting, stories about what phenomenology is offering us. Part of that conflicting story involves the passage you were quoting, which of course is only the first half, because he then continues to say, well, on the one hand, there's this idea that phenomenology is about essences, but at the same time, he says phenomenology is also a philosophy of facticity. It wants us to somehow return to the world, and so he presents us with a number of kind of binary choices, and then he says, okay, what should we do? Is this ultimately a question of choosing either Husserl or Heidegger? And then he goes on to say, no, that's a much too easy solution, because ultimately you can actually find these binary or these dichotomies in Husserl's own work. And then, I mean, the way I would read Merleau-Ponty is that he then says what we need to do if we want to understand the phenomenological project is really to try to carve out an understanding that encompasses both of those dimensions. So phenomenology is about essences, but it's also about facticity. It's not a question of having to choose one over the other. And so I think, again, just to quickly, say, as far as I know, Merleau-Ponty wrote the preface after he had, finished Phenomenology of Perception. So you can also, to some extent, read the preface as a kind of summary of Merleau-Ponty's vision of phenomenology. And so it's, of course, it's a very concise depiction of a certain view on phenomenology. And I mean, that's why I thought it was a kind of a nice way to, to conclude that first part of the book.
I'm wondering, for Zavi, if you could, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, give a few examples to kind of illustrate what Merleau-Ponty would mean by, phenomenology being about essences, but also it being about a philosophy of facticity. Like, if we could probably use a few examples to kind of illustrate that.
Yeah, well, so to some extent, there's this ongoing discussion about essentialism, where I think in some circles, essentialism is kind of viewed as something very bad. And I can understand, I can somehow, I can understand, reservations about essentialism if you're confronted with an essentialism concerning, say, social or cultural roles. And so, in some authors, you find extensive, in some authors presenting themselves as phenomenologists, you can find discussions of the essence of motherhood, for instance, or the essence of the feminine existence. And I can understand why people would have all kinds of qualms about those kinds of the attempt of somehow finding cross-cultural, atemporal, invariant structures defining motherhood, for instance. I don't think those are the kind of essences that Husserl or Merleau-Ponty are interested in. Husserl is interested in trying to understand, for instance, the difference between what he would call ontological regions. And so he says, well, there is a difference between experiences, spatiotemporal objects, idealities, socially constituted cultural products. And the difference between, say, these four regions are not contingent. It's not as if, the difference between experience, an ongoing experience with a certain temporal articulation, and the square root of 4, it's not as if that categorical distinction only holds true in 20th century Europe, whereas if we go to, Japan in the 16th century, those two categories were somehow blurry. I think Husserl would regard that as being nonsensical. I think so. So on the one hand, there is a certain, attempt at carving out or trying to, to philosophize about fundamental differences. And personally, I don't find anything problematic in that. I think that one can do that, and of course, one should be open to the possible revisability of whatever definitions one then come up with. But I also think that this is very much also what science in general is up to. Science is not interested in contingent structures. Science is interested in invariant structures. So on the one hand, there is that focus. But I think what Merleau-Ponty is also insisting upon, and I also think Husserl, is this idea of not getting lost in abstraction. We also need to bring back philosophy to the life world, to the world of everyday life, to the world we all know and care about. And I mean, there's this fantastic story that I also reference in the book about that we can find in Simone de Beauvoir, where she talks about how she and Sartre was first introduced to phenomenology. They were meeting their friend Raymond Aron in a cocktail bar in Paris. Aron had just been in Berlin, and he was very, excitedly telling them about his encounter with phenomenology. And then at one point, he says to Sartre, "Well, if you're doing phenomenology, you can philosophize about, an apricot cocktail," which was what they were drinking right then. I mean, the moment Sartre heard that, according to Beauvoir, I mean, he got really excited, because the idea that philosophy could connect with everyday, entities, and not just be about very dry, abstract, kind of speculative entities, was for Sartre, a very good thing, a very forceful, aspect, and so that's why Sartre then decided to go to Germany to study philosophy, to study phenomenology. So I think that is part of this return to facticity. There's, of course, also a focus on our concrete embodied existence. I mean, that it also has to be philosophy that includes a consideration of the fact that we are mortal, finite cognizers. And again, I mean, one could kind of go on, but I think at least those are some of the aspects that I think goes into Merleau-Ponty's insistence on phenomenology having to kind of encompass both of those sides.
Brilliant. Now, I certainly have questions about the life world when we get to more of the parts on social ontology. And in the book, you also, in the 2003 book, you discuss kind of this relationship between the life world and even science, which I would certainly like to touch on in a bit. And yeah, the apricot cocktail thing, I think people outside of kind of academic philosophy would know this book. It's called At the Existentialist Cafe by Sarah Bakewell, and it starts off describing this scenario. And it was a really fun book. I read it a while back, and it was beautifully written. Wonderful. Now I want to get to again a bit of a big topic in philosophy. Really, not even sure how to pose this question. However, it's good that, because I think you mentioned, you said you were initially interested in Aristotle. So, but I also want to discuss Kant, because obviously, Kant has the idea of transcendental philosophy and transcendental subjectivity, and in this book, you kind of go into detail really the difference between Kant and Husserl. So, to put it really simply, Professor Zahavi, how would you explain the difference between Kant's transcendental philosophy and Husserl's transcendental philosophy?
Sorry. So, I mean, perhaps again, just perhaps one preliminary comment, which has to do with Husserl's own appraisal of Kant, because it kind of varied, in the course of his life. So Husserl actually started out being fairly, how should we put it, unfriendly to Kant, which I think partly had to do with Husserl kind of coming out of a certain Brentanian way of thinking, and Brentano and the Brentano school was in general rather hostile to Kant. So I think that is also where Husserl started out. But on the one hand, as a result of arriving at the University of Göttingen, where a number of very prominent neo-Kantians were teaching, and also as a result of his own kind of philosophical development, Husserl then came to recognize a certain affinity between his own way of doing philosophy and Kant's way. And I think the perhaps easiest way to highlight the similarity is basically by picking up on on a statement that Husserl himself makes when he says that, or when he credits Kant or praises Kant for his Copernican turn. And I think that is really, I think, one of the decisive similarities. I mean, this idea that rather than doing naive metaphysics, rather than simply being interested in what are the fundamental building blocks of the universe, the idea is, no, we need to kind of reflect upon our cognitive, affective appraisal or access to the world as the proper way into also an understanding of reality. So we cannot describe reality from a point of nowhere. We need to describe reality from a first person perspective. I think this is partly what Husserl appreciates by Kant, even though, I mean, things of course gets complicated, because then speaking of the first person perspective, of course, also indicates Husserl's appraisal of Descartes, and he thinks that Descartes to some extent were more respectful of the importance of the first person perspective than Kant, which is also why Husserl, to kind of be a little bit more technical, prefers the first edition of Kritik der reinen Vernunft to the second edition, because in the first edition there's actually more of a interest in psychology than in the second edition. Anyway, that can quickly get complicated, but the basic idea is that we need, according to Husserl, according to Kant, we need to reflect upon our epistemic apparatus if we want to describe and philosophize about the world. And I think that's the main general commonality, and of course one outcome of that is also that any talk of the world as being completely independent of us, of the world as being completely untouched by our cognitive apprehension is for Husserl a kind of wrong way of posing the question. And again, I mean, then differences start to come up between Husserl and Kant, because Husserl does not like Kant's notion of the thing in itself, that he thinks introduces a dualism that Husserl wants to get rid of. But again, to try to really compress what is, of course, pretty complicated. I mean, the main idea, the main commonality really has to do with this Copernican turn. And then the question is, well, where are all the differences? And I think perhaps one way of portraying the differences is that in Kant, I mean, you have a certain way of trying to summarize the fundamental structures of experience. So there's a certain finite set of categories with which we come to comprehend the world. You don't find anything similar in Husserl. There's no attempt of trying to, deduce a certain finite list. Rather, I think Husserl has a much less systematic, but at the same time a much more fluid or dynamic understanding of what are ultimately the transcendental structures, which is also the reason why I think Husserl is eventually able to include something like historicity, sociality into his transcendental analysis. And I think in making that move, I think he kind of points the way towards 20th century philosophy, and away from a more kind of strict or restricted conception of what transcendental philosophy is that we find in Kant.
Indeed. So I assume you would say Husserl wouldn't be a fan of this Kant's notion of 12 categories and all of this taxonomic kind of business that he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, excellent. That's really useful. And I do also, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but from reading your Husserl book, one thing I kind of felt was like, I don't know, there's something about, I don't know if there's a proper term here, but it seems to me Kant's subject is like this very abstract concept. It's almost like a schema even. Whereas Husserl really wants to bring us down to earth, so to speak, like the life world, the body, and all of that. And
Well, I mean,
that's beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, so just one further comment to that, because I mean, when looking at phenomenology, I think one of the fascinating things has been the fact that it has been picked up and has influenced a lot of non-academic, or rather, sorry, delete that, a lot of non-philosophical disciplines.
Yeah.
So, I mean, other academic disciplines outside of philosophy. And of course, you do find it taken up by psychiatrists, psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, nurses. I mean, there are lots of disciplines where people have thought, well, there's a lot of interesting ideas from phenomenology that we can use in our discipline. Now, I think part of the reason for that is precisely what you just pointed to. I mean, you don't, I think, find the same uptake of Kant's Kritik der reinen Vernunft. And I think part of it, of course, precisely has to do with the fact that Husserl is framing it in a way that also resonates with everyday life. I mean, again, coming back to Sartre's excitement. I mean, so again, and it's not, I'm not denying, of course, that Husserl can also be very abstruse and abstract, but he's also, again, including or offering analysis of a number of phenomena that speaks to, I think, most of us. And I think that is also, I think, one of the reasons for this uptake in other disciplines.
Certainly. And like, I mean, I don't know. For me, I mean, I haven't really studied academic philosophy until recently, until I just started my master's. But I mean, my background's in computer science. And initially, around 2019, 2020, when I came across phenomenology, it was really through lectures online. And there's something very, even enticing in the fact that there could be this philosophical system, or, well, in loosely speaking, that really speaks to like day to day, how I perceive an object, or how I exist in the world, my intersubjective experience, almost like this, this givenness of our lives. And then of course Heidegger gets into more of the existential phenomenology, which gets a lot more interesting there. Wonderful. I couldn't agree more with that statement. Okay, before we get to more of the social ontology, I do want to touch on this critique, if I could put it that way, of phenomenology. So I've only read one article on this, so I mean, maybe I'm kind of speaking kind of off course here, but phenomenology, I mean, you present it even in this book as it being a presuppositionalist philosophy. So, and you try to present what that means. But then also, and again, maybe I'm mistaken here, I think one of the critiques of the critical theorists, so people like Adorno, is that phenomenology tends to kind of be this, presuppositionalist, lived experience, or like first person perspective, and that it doesn't account for history, it's undialectical, it doesn't account for counting the Marxist and materialist conditions and all of that. So I'm wondering, I guess, again, about bipartite question. Firstly, when you say phenomenology is a presuppositionalist philosophy, what do you mean by that? And if you are, if you agree with my kind of characterization of the critique by Adorno, do you think that's a fair critique to say that phenomenology doesn't account for, that it's undialectical in nature?
So I think, I mean,
sorry, that was a lot there now. But
no, it's all fine. So I mean, concerning the presuppositionlessness, I mean, it's not a phrase that I am particularly happy about. Now, Husserl does use it occasionally, but I think it's very important to be clear about what exactly he means by it. Because, I mean, one way to interpret it would be a bit like, would be to make a contrast between him on the one hand and Gadamer on the other. Gadamer as a...
I think there's something wrong with the audio. Just give me a second.
Personally, I'm not very fond of the notion of presuppositionlessness, because I think it's very easy to misunderstand. And I mean, one way to understand it would be to say, well, it points to the huge difference between Husserl on the one hand, who somehow thinks that we can and that we ought to encounter everything in the world as blank slates to some extent. And the contrast could be Gadamer, who insists that, well, any understanding is based on and draws upon, prejudices in the sense of prior experience that somehow forms and constrains how you encounter the world. So, I mean, that would be one way of understanding what presuppositionless might mean, but I definitely do not think that that is what Husserl has in mind. When he talks about presuppositionlessness, he has one very, very specific thing in mind. There's one very, very specific presupposition that he wants us to get rid of. That's what this is all about. And the presupposition in question is basically what you could call objectivism, namely the idea that reality is just out there in all its splendor, independently of us. It's that metaphysical presupposition that he wants us to get rid of, and that he thinks phenomenology needs to kind of suspend or bracket. So I think there's a very specific, reasoning behind this notion, even though I think it has been misinterpreted. And it's not mysterious why it has been misinterpreted, because I think it can very easily be misinterpreted. Anyway, the question was then also, how does that relate to, the kind of criticism that, say, critical theory have voiced vis-a-vis Husserl. And I mean, it's kind of interesting because a couple of months ago, I participated in a panel discussion at the biannual meeting of the it's a meeting that takes place every 2 years of the German Society for Logical Research, about the relationship between phenomenology and critical theory, together with Martin Saar and Hartmut Rosa. And what I think is currently happening in critical theory is actually a certain rapprochement to phenomenology, which I think is kind of interesting, because it's certainly moving in a direction that is somewhat different from certain other periods of the history of critical theory. Now, Adorno has, of course, written on Husserl, but I also have to say that I find his reading of Husserl extremely misleading. Let me put it like that. I mean, what you can read Adorno claiming, or what Adorno claims in a variety of his readings, or in a variety of his writings on Husserl, is that Husserl was preoccupied with a very narrow epistemological Cartesian project, that Husserl was a positivist, a classical rationalist, a metaphysical speculator. Adorno even says that Husserl was the most static thinker of his period. And I mean, all of this doesn't really make any sense if one reads, say, Crisis. And I think it's not surprising that Adorno had actually never read Crisis, because if you had read Crisis, the idea that Husserl should be preoccupied again with a narrow epistemological project, that he should be completely static and not consider the importance of history, I mean, it's impossible to uphold that kind of interpretation. So I think whatever. I mean, I think there might be specific reasons why Adorno was pushing this specific line of interpretation. But I think, I mean, coming from a Husserl scholarship perspective, it's like, I mean, we can't, I mean, I really do not find it of any interest whatsoever, I have to say. I mean, Adorno probably has a lot of interesting things to say on his own, but qua an interpreter of Husserl, I don't think he is kind of worth reading, basically.
That's certainly fair. I mean, I read critical theory more for like, let's call it like the political and social analysis, and not particularly for like, I don't go to them to like read about phenomenology, even though, I mean, I believe it's not Horkheimer, but there were a few of the critical theorists who were really influenced by Heidegger, for instance.
Sure. I mean, actually, I mean, it's a complicated story. I mean, and I think both Horkheimer and Adorno, I mean, also they were studying also with neo-Kantians who were close to Husserl, and of course, I mean, in Habermas you find engagement with Husserl. In Honneth, you also so there's a steady kind of exchange or discussion of phenomenology, and I think this is also perhaps one of the reasons why today, I think quite reasonably, there is an interest in by critical theory for phenomenology. And I would say, well, if you're interested in social theory, well, then I think you should be interested also in a philosophical account of social reality, an account that tries to factor in intersubjectivity, embodiment, the life world. And of course, that's precisely what phenomenology has done all along. And then, of course, you could say, well, what about the critical potential? And here, of course, I mean, there has also, and a lot has also happened in recent years, because there has been this resurgence of what today is called critical phenomenology, that tries to use phenomenology specifically and targeted, to address, problems of social injustice, problems of marginalization, to use phenomenology for political purposes. And I mean, again, there is a discussion to what extent this is a complete rupture with classical phenomenology, or to what extent, from the very outset, I mean, there has been, there has been an interest from the side of phenomenology with political issues, perhaps sometimes not always, in a left-leaning way, Heidegger being the most obvious, exception to that. But anyway, I mean, the whole focus about to what extent phenomenology might have something to say about political issues, I mean, it's much more on the philosophical agenda today than it was, say, 20 years ago. So there is a very, I think, dynamic, ongoing discussion about these issues.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what's this? Iris Young's, Thrown Like a Girl, probably one of the most important essays on like feminist theory, and that's all the body and Merleau-Ponty and the Beauvoir and all of that. So, but also, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, in your Routledge book, you do have a section specifically on critical phenomenology, and maybe I'm completely, bullshitting here, but I think you do say something along the lines of that, classical phenomenology already had a kind of a critical side to it. So it's not like it's not like critical phenomenology is like this brand new thing that's like a rupture, as you say, but phenomenology already was somewhat critical at the outset, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, perhaps just one way to put it perhaps slightly slogan-like. I mean, just as I'm not so fond of making, clear demarcations between pure phenomenology or transcendental phenomenology, existential phenomenology, hermeneutic phenomenology, I also don't really like talking of critical phenomenology as a new type of phenomenology. I think it's much better to talk about a critical use of phenomenology. And I think there were previous or earlier instances of that, and there are current instances of that. I think that way of talking. I mean, I find it much less objectionable than kind of presenting critical phenomenology precisely as a completely new phase of phenomenology.
I promise this will be the only interruption. In the past few years, I truly have cherished connecting with all you listeners of this podcast, whether through email, video calls, or simply the comments. And I'd hate to lose this fledgling community we've built around our shared love for philosophy and science, and so I'm kindly asking you to consider subscribing to this podcast on Substack. Let's cut the BS. In our techno-feudalist times, no platform is perfect, and at the end of the day, these companies own us. However, if I may naively be hopeful, Substack at least allows me to export email addresses for me to keep connected with you all if one of these platforms decides to kick me off for some reason, which, as we're well aware, they've done in the past with no explanation. In fact, this almost happened to me recently. So please, let's stay connected through Substack, and if all else fails, at least the good old SMT protocol. That is a nerdy joke for you programmers out there. Absolutely, yeah. I think this is a great segue to get into kind of the social philosophy or social ontology. And I want to start off by discussing the relationship between the sciences and the life world, Professor. And you have a section in the book on that too. But before that, again, a bit of a conceptual clarification. So there are two, and I've kind of struggled with this personally. There are two concepts. There's the life world, and then there's world constitution. Do you mind are both of these concepts speaking of the same thing? Or what really is the difference between the life world and the world constitution?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I think that's a little bit misleading. I mean, I think to carve it up as if that should be two different things.
Fair.
I mean, so I think that, I mean, a better way. I mean, well, again, I'm not entirely sure where you're coming from, but I mean, one way of reading the later Husserl would be to say, in Crisis, there's a focus on the life world, and the moment Husserl talks about the life world, that signals his departure from a focus on constituting subjectivity. I think that's a misunderstanding. I mean, the life world is not supposed to replace an interest in and a focus on constituting subjectivity. It's just, it's a way of complicating or cashing out what constituting subjectivity is. So I mean, speaking of the world as constituted, I mean, the life world is also constituted. I mean, Husserl would never say, well, there's a life world, even in a mindless universe, it's just there. Of course not. I mean, there's a life world when they are experiencing agents and not independently of them. So I mean, what one might say is that when Husserl starts talking about the life world, I mean, he's also to some extent including the life world as a contributor to the constitutive process. I mean, which might, signal a certain, clarification vis-a-vis some of his, earlier statements. But this is not supposed somehow to be, again, a replacement of or a rejection of any talk of constitution. I mean, I think that would be a misunderstanding.
Certainly, and I forgive me if I did. My question, I wasn't intending to do that. I was more curious because, like, again, there are these two concepts or two terms I hear when discussing Husserl and phenomenology, and I kind of wanted to understand. But I think you put it quite well. That it's not a replacement, but rather perhaps something that's that kind of in relation to each other. Wonderful. All right, apropos the life world. So firstly, if you're outlining or explaining what the life world is to a non-expert in philosophy or someone who hasn't read too much into Husserl and phenomenology, how would you do so? But while you're just outlining that, Professor, could you also importantly kind of speak to the relationship between science, again, what is science? Another question, and the life world.
Sure. Yeah, no. So I mean, again, I guess an easy way of introducing the notion of the life world is to say, well, it's the world we are living in, it's the world we inhabit, it's the world we feel at home in, it's the world we are initially acquainted with and familiar with, it's the world of experience, it's the world that is also structured our by references to our embodiment. It's a world also structured by social relations. So it's very much, if you will, it's very much a world that is subject relative. But again, I think the most important point perhaps is that it's very much a world also of pre-scientific experience, a world of everyday life. And that's, of course, where the contrast then comes into the world of science. Because in the life world, what do you find there? I mean, you find, team marks, computers, tables, streets, newspapers, buildings, bicycles, universities, municipalities, trees, stones, clouds, and you also, of course, find it populated importantly by other people who, in the first instance, do not, that you do not come across as instances of Homo sapiens, but as colleagues, friends, competitors, family members, etc. And that, I think, is all suggesting, again, in contrast to the world as described and explained and accounted for by science. So, I mean, in the life world, there are not, in the first instance, subatomic particles, neural circuits, DNA. I mean, all the structures, all the mechanisms that science is in the business of uncovering is not in the first instance available and accessible in the life world. And the big question then is, what should we do with these two somewhat different and differing perspectives on the world? I mean, are we ultimately confronted with two different worlds? I mean, the world of science and the life world? Might it be the world of science that is ultimately the true world, true reality, whereas the life world is merely, our misconceived, subjective, confabulation, which I think sometimes some scientists would favor that way of depicting it. And of course, what you find the phenomenologists insisting upon is no. I mean, first of all, we are not dealing with two different worlds, nor is the life world simply a kind of subjective misconfabulation. Rather, the life world serves a very important role as the foundation for any scientific enterprise. It's the life world. I mean, that's where we encounter questions that call for scientific clarification. That's where we encounter objects that can serve as, explananda for scientific investigations. It's in the life world that we conduct experiments, and it's in the life world that we discuss and interpret the experimental findings. And so to dismiss the life world as one big illusion would, for the phenomenologists, be tantamount to basically cutting off the cutting off the sorry, what is that in English? I mean, if you're sitting on a tree, the branch. I mean,
The
cutting off the
branch,
branch
yes.
that you are sitting on. So I think they would say there's something self-undermining. I mean, in basically claiming that the world of experience is some kind of illusion. So again, what you find in phenomenology is not a dismissal of science. It's not a rejection of science, but it is an insistence that scientific findings and scientific endeavor is very much based upon and drawing on embodied perceptual experiential findings.
Indeed. I mean, oh gosh, there's like so much I can say about this, because like I think I mean, I guess in a way, for me personally, I've kind of been in this world of reading philosophy and phenomenology for a few years now, and I came across phenomenology when I was about 19, 20, and it's interesting because like it's really common these days. Like even if you take like the self-help industry, and then there's this really interesting, I would say, very peculiar relationship between the self-help industry and kind of pop psychology or pop neuroscience, where they would try to like explain a phenomenon like love, or even a phenomenon like depression or melancholia through like some chemical imbalance in the brain, or it could be it's something to do with your physiology. You know, you got to exercise more or something like that. But I find it quite interesting because it's like at the end of the day, I mean, if you take a step back and if you're in love, you don't experience love as like oxytocin or some molecule in your brain, nor do you experience something like melancholia or depression as like something, something that can be, for lack of a better term, be put in a spreadsheet. You know, you can't just probably where like positive psychology, you can't grade your sadness on a scale of 1 to 10. So, and then here probably is again where, as you were kind of pointing out before, there's this rich contribution phenomenology can make to fields like psychology, or psychotherapy, and whatnot. So yeah, that was brilliant, Professor. But also, I want to mention this, and this I found again really interesting. I was reading it in your book. In fact, for the audience, I'm just going to read it verbatim. I think there's no better way for me to put it. You say here, I think in page 130, you say, science is founded on the life world, so it's the branch, as you mentioned, and will eventually sink down into the ground it's standing on. As time goes by, theoretical assumptions are assimilated into the daily praxis, becoming part of the life world. So I found that quite interesting, because it's like how scientific notions, and maybe I can think of like evolution, for instance, just becoming a part of our life world, like everyone else. And there's even like, it even manifests in very toxic forms, like for instance, like social Darwinism, or like survival of the fittest, and all these things that are coming from kind of the scientific language into our life world. Brilliant.
I actually had another, I think, example in mind when I was writing that passage, and that was something like sun cream. I mean, why do you use sun cream? I mean, it is, of course, motivated by certain scientific findings about what overexposure to sun can do to your skin. I mean, so there's of course a scientific background to that, but it's not something we perhaps think too much about when applying the sun cream, which has so much become a part of daily practice, at least in some areas.
Indeed, I think it's a lot better example, because it's more grounded than like something like evolution, because this is like a daily thing you do when you go out to the beach or whatever. Yeah, wonderful. All right, so the other thing, now that we're kind of getting into the life world, and then you did certainly mention intersubjectivity, I want to kind of discuss the notion of the other here. So first of all, I do have, again, this is more of I'm trying to connect this one statement you make about the other to somewhat of a totally different philosophy, which is object-oriented philosophy. Before we even get to that, do you mind, how would you kind of explicate the notion of the other from like a phenomenological perspective?
Well, I mean, I think, when saying the other and when thinking about, what phenomenologists might have had something to say on that topic, I mean, in my mind at least, I mean, there are three figures that immediately pops up, and that is Husserl, Sartre, and Levinas.
Levinas, of course.
Which of course are kind of addressing it in slightly different ways, but I think what is the kind of commonality in all cases is the idea that the author, and talking about the author here, is talking about the other subject. I think that's a kind of an important factor. So the idea would be that the other, I mean, another subject, I mean, is characterized by alterity, is characterized by a kind of transcendence, which is more radical than the transcendence of ordinary objects. So there is something elusive, something, ungraspable about another subject.
I think the term you use is inaccessible.
Yes,
in the book. Yeah.
And of course, then again, I mean, you will find, again, Husserl, Sartre, and Levinas discussing this in different ways. I mean, Levinas, obviously, it's more the ethical dimension, and Sartre, it's very much about the gaze. It's about you being looked at by another, which is something very different than what, your desk. I mean, your desk cannot address you, cannot objectify you, but another subject can. And for Husserl, I mean, the other has a very particular role to play in his attempt to account for something like objective validity. So I mean, for him, objective validity is very much linked to something that is experienceable or accessible by a multiplicity of different perspectives. And so my experience of a certain object also being available to another subject will change or transform or enrich my understanding of said object. I mean, so again, different takes on it, but the commonalities is this insistence on the perspective of the other not being reducible, not being mergeable, not being, conflatable with my own perspective.
Yeah, I mean, for me, of course, certainly, as you mentioned, it was really the kind of the ethical dimension of the other of Levinas that spoke to me quite deeply. Especially in Levinas, he was a Jew that survived the Holocaust, so all of that the story there. But it's also really kind of interesting that, like, I think you kind of do intimate at this even in the Husserl book, this notion that there's something about the other, the subject relation, that simply doesn't fit into, almost something alien that doesn't fit into your order of things. And I think Levinas says that you need to respect that total otherness, the alterity. You can never integrate that into your being, so to speak. So again, this is probably a bit of a provocation on my end, Professor Zahavi, but I'm curious because I did mention this when I interviewed Graham Harman, the object-oriented ontologist and kind of the speculative realist. And well, basically, if I could really put his argument, what he's trying to say is that, yes, he agrees that, if you take this subject relation, that there is like this surplus to a subject, that is something you can't fully, it's inaccessible, you can't fully grasp it. Now, he argues that this exists even within objects. Now, obviously, for me, my first thought is, okay, a phenomenologist wouldn't even speak of like this term of like object, subject, like that probably isn't much of a big deal. But then I guess what Graham Harman is trying to say, Professor Harman is trying to say, is that, like, yes, this surplus, the term he uses from like Marxian philosophy, is that this surplus, for instance, if you take, okay, there's a surplus between our kind of reaction right now, like this interaction, but he would say this cup of tea, on my desk, and then the desk also, that there's like a there's a dimension that can't be fully integrated between objects too, and that subjects shouldn't be given this priority over objects. And in fact, in his book, he calls it the flat ontology. So there was a lot there again. I apologize, but like, I'm curious, what would your response be to that sort of line of thought?
You have addressed it quite explicitly in an article called "The End of What? Speculative Realism versus Phenomenology,"
Fascinating.
which is
read it.
Very critical of speculative realism and also of Graham Harman. So I mean, I've kind of been there. Yeah. So I mean,
Oh, brilliant! I can't believe I haven't come across this.
Yeah.
No, I'll leave it in the show notes.
Yeah. No, it's fine. Yeah. So I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how to respond very briefly. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I find, the notion of flat ontology, I find it very difficult even to understand. I mean, because one of the obvious questions to ask would precisely be the issue of ethics. I mean, as we just said, for Husserl and Sartre and Levinas, I mean, the elusiveness and alterity of the other, of course, also goes hand in hand with a respect for, the perspective of the other. And if you really were saying, well, there is no difference, there's no reason to valorize, the perspective of another human being or another animal any more than to respect, I don't know what to call it, but the elusiveness of my teacup or my table. I mean, just think about in moral terms what that would entail. I mean, would it then mean that, walking on a beach, kicking sand, well, there's no difference between that and, I don't know, going into a kindergarten and
kicking a child.
Exactly. Yeah. No. So I don't even understand what this is supposed to mean. And of course, I mean, when it comes to other people, I mean, the idea that there is more to them than what I can grasp is partly related to the idea that other people have a first-person perspective on their own. I mean, so there is the issue of mutual address. There is the issue of them being able to objectify me with their specific perspective. And I mean, again, when they are feeling pain, I have a certain experience of them now being in pain, but again, I can never experience their pain in the same way as they are living through it first personally. And they will also, I think, will highlight that fact. I mean, if you were to say to somebody who were in pain, well, I mean, I feel your pain, or I have precisely the same access to your pain as you have. There's nothing in your pain experience that eludes my grasp. I think the person rightfully would object. So I think the fact that there is something more going on than what is accessible to us. I mean, there's something subjectively going on in the other that is not available and accessible to outsiders, is something that each of us can confirm. Now, when you are telling me, or when Graham Harman is telling me that there is something in the teacup that eludes me, what exactly is the idea here? I mean, I would agree that there's a richness to the teacup in the sense that it can always display itself in further aspects. I mean, this is something that both Husserl and Merleau-Ponty were already acknowledging. But if you are saying that there is an interiority to the teacup, it has a self-relation or a first-person perspective that eludes my grasp, I would say this is complete speculation. I mean, I have no idea on what basis claims like that should be. I don't know what the basis should be. I mean, and which I guess
Yeah.
fits well with the idea that it's a form of speculative realism. I mean, I would emphasize the speculation.
Well, I did ask from Professor Hammond because, like, I mean, you know, why not just, I guess, you know, subscribe to panpsychism? But then he is very clear in outlining that no, he's not saying that these objects have like consciousness or first-person perspective. But then, of course, I mean, in fact, that's really interesting that you brought in the ethical dimension to this. I didn't even think of it that way. I was thinking of it more in the way of like, yes, of course, an object can manifest in different forms, and it is inexhaustible. But I wouldn't say that it has like an, I don't know, like an alterity or like an alienness the way another human being would or another subject would.
Well, no, again, I mean, I think, you know, other people, I mean, they have different perspectives on the same world than we have. I don't think a teacup has a perspective on the world. And I mean, it might be that Hamann, you know, would not buy into the panpsychism idea, but there are other object-oriented ontologists who explicitly talks about
like
the
vitalism.
Yeah, I mean, they say, well, there's a what it's likeness to being a computer cable. What is that supposed to mean? I mean, I can see why there's a what it's likeness to the having of experiences. I don't think there's a what it's likeness to being a teacup or a computer cable. I mean, so again, but you know, as I said, I have written on the topic. I have also publicly said that I did not want to waste any more of my time on speculative realism. So I think we should just, you know, move on.
That's done. Yeah, I've got to say, I mean, you're always such a cordial and congenial kind of thinker when you do it publicly, but this is the first time I've seen you a bit your passionate rebuttal of Triple O. So we shall move on. But I couldn't help myself but mention it, especially because for some reason I was recently listening to a Graham Hammond lecture, and it was along the time that we were emailing, and I was like, oh, it would be interesting to see what Professor Zahavi's views on this are. But as you did mention, for the interested listener, I'll leave that article in the show notes if they're interested. Excellent. So, Professor Zahavi, given we've gone over an hour now, I realize we haven't even gotten into your more recent work, which is Being We. Firstly, is it okay to go for another maybe 20 minutes, around 20 minutes?
Yeah, but I think 20 minutes would have to be the limit because I have another meeting I need to, yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. I really, really appreciate this. I mean, I don't want to repeat the same questions you were asked in previous interviews about this book. So what I'm really interested in is this notion of shared intentionality. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to that concept of shared intentionality apropos social philosophy.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, perhaps just to take one step backwards, because I guess, I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do in this new book of mine, Being We, is to try to draw on from logical resources to also address issues that are currently being discussed in debates on collective intentionality. And I think one way of summarizing one of the main things that I'm doing in the book is basically to try to highlight what are the subjective and intersubjective preconditions for something like we experiences, or we relationships, or collective forms of collective intentionality. So I'm talking a lot about, you know, different notions of self. I'm talking a lot about different types of intersubjective understanding. And I think, I mean, then trying to address your question, I mean, what might shared experiences amount to? So one of the questions I raise is basically the following. In many discussions of collective intentionality, I mean, there's primarily a focus on joint action. You know, so how do we paint a house together? How do we prepare food together? How do we go for a walk together. So it's action that kind of is the paradigmatic case. And I mean, action obviously is a very important topic. But one of the things I'm also doing in the book is to say, well, I mean, is that the only kind of shared, is that the only instance of shared intentions that we can come across? And I have an interest also in trying to clarify something like shared affects. And one of the things I then point out is that, well, again, if you look at discussions in the kind of more mainstream debate on collective intentionality, I mean, there's a certain recognition of the fact that we can only have collective intentionality, or we can only share intentions if we somehow have an awareness of the other. If there's some, to quote Tuomula, if there's a certain signaling occurring between us. And I think that kind of points the finger at a an issue that needs much further elaboration, because having some kind of awareness of each other or signaling to each other, I mean, that can happen in so many different modalities. And I think if we're talking about, something like, say, shared affects, and what could that be? It could be, us laughing over a joke together, or us enjoying a movie together. I mean, I think that actually calls for something more than me merely signaling to you in some way. I think it actually involves some kind of perceptual co-presence. It involves me having a bodily resonance with you. I mean, so if we are sitting together in the cinema, I mean, it's not enough, say, that or to put it differently, there would be a difference, I would claim, in our experience between the two following scenarios. So we enter the cinema together, and then I sit all to the left, and you sit all to the right. And so we both know that the other is in the cinema. And then we are watching the movie. And it might be that my experience of the movie is somehow influenced by the fact that I have knowledge of you actually also at the same time being in the cinema. But I think that's a very different scenario than if we go into the cinema, sit next to each other, and throughout the watching of the movie, we constantly pick up on and respond to the emotional expressivity of the other, so that there is a kind of co-regulation of our emotional life. And I would qualify that latter situation as one that could potentially lead to an instance of shared emotions. And again, shared emotions does not mean that there is one subject. It does not mean that there's only one experience. I do think in order for the emotion to be shared, that there has to be two subjects, there has to be two experiences, but those experiences can be coupled in such a tight way that they only have the character they have as a result of being in this specific context. And I'm also, again, it's a kind of a longer story, but one of the things that I'm also pointing out is that it's not just a question of the co-regulation of the emotions, it's also a question of my own self-experience when undergoing this experience. Am I experiencing myself primarily as a, if you will, independent individual, or am I experiencing myself as one of us, as part of a dyad, as part of a unit? So I also think that in order to understand shared experiences, we need to look at the subject side. We need to look at my own self-experience or self-awareness, and that's where the we kind of pops in. So it's a complicated story, but I think this whole story adds something to a focus merely on action, And I think highlighting again the subjective and intersubjective preconditions again is a way of highlighting what the phenomenological tradition also has to bring, to this specific topic.
Indeed. I mean, I'll be quick. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine.
Oh, sorry. I'll be quick with my example. But when I was reading this section of your book on shared intentionality in the Being We book, I was writing an essay for my one of my units for my masters, and at the same time, I was also following the rugby league in Australia. And one of my mates, we both are rugby fans. So I realized, I mean, I even used this example when I was trying to kind of explicate what you were meant by shared intentionality. So we went to watch one NRL game at the stadium together, and we watched it. So for me, that was a very distinct phenomenon, a very distinct we experience with my mate Mitch, and then obviously all the other fans. But then also, I watched another game of rugby, same team, different game, obviously, just on my couch by myself. I mean, obviously there were many other people watching that same game as individual eyes, but anyone would agree that that experience is still a distinct experience to watching it at the stadium. So anyway, that's just, and so for me, when I was reading all of this is again why I love phenomenology, because again, it's about just the world we experience. I thought that was brilliant. All right, wonderful, Professor Zabi. All right, this is my final question, really. I would like just to kind of conclude on this note. So let me see if I could be succinct with this. I guess there are two ways. I kind of want to kind of hear your views on the notion of a group. Like, how would you, how would you kind of elucidate what a group is? Because I guess two ways of looking at it is, one would be, for lack of a better term, the liberal lens, where a group is a collection of eyes, an amalgamation of eyes, or then more of, maybe you would call it the radical social constructivist lens, which is like, okay, all there is there to individuals is just their social environment, and then that's all the individuals. The individuals is a result of their social and material environment. Now, I don't think you would agree with that, because I also do know that you do defend this minimal notion of a self. So, along with that idea, how would you outline what a group is, while also accounting for this minimal notion of a self?
Okay, so I think it's helpful to distinguish different types of groups, and I think that when talking about a we, I think we are talking about a specific type of group, because there are groups where, as I also point out in the book, where membership can be assigned on the basis of the possession of external properties. So, I mean, you might have certain properties, for instance, your blood type. Having that blood type makes you a member of the group with that blood type. And I mean, your membership of that group does not depend upon your interest in being a member. It does not depend on you identifying with the group in question. You might even be a member if you strongly disidentify with the group in question. I mean, whatever you think about it, of experience, doesn't matter. That's one kind of group. Another kind of group is precisely one that involves a kind of a we perspective, where you identify with the group in question. And I think that's the kind of group that I'm interested in exploring in the book. Then the question is, well, how that kind of group, I mean, that somehow involves or draws upon your own first-person perspective. I mean, what happens to the first-person perspective when you come to identify with and experience yourself as a group member? And I think that, I think we need to navigate between two extremes, two, in my view, misleading positions. So one is this aggregative summative, or if you will, reductionistic account that says there's nothing to groups except simply a summation of already fully formed individual subjects. That's one view. Another view is, no, well, either the group has a mind of its own, there's a kind of a collective consciousness that takes over. I mean, fans of Star Trek often mentions the Borgs. I mean, there's a hive mind, that is somehow what a group should have. So that would be one, I think, extreme view. Another extreme view would be to say that it's the group or the community that somehow allows for something like individual perspectives to emerge. Now, I'm disagreeing with both of these two extremes. I think that group membership basically transforms, enriches, shapes, modifies what it means to be a subject, what it means to be an individual. So, which is why I think any reductionistic account that says that no, a group is simply a summation of pre-existing, pre-social individuals is just completely overlooking how transformative group membership can be. And likewise, I would say that the hive mind, collective consciousness. I mean, I have all kinds of issues with the idea that is something like that in the first place. But perhaps the other more mainstream view that it's the community that somehow give rise to individual perspectives. I think it's very important here to distinguish different notions of perspective or different notions of individuality, because I think in some sense, I think there's something right to this view. I do think that there are aspects of selfhood or there are ways of being individual that are really enabled by and preconditioned by our social environment. And so there are ways of becoming a person that could never happen if we were solitary creatures. But I also think there's another notion of self, a kind of more minimal notion of self that has to do with the very first person perspective, that has to do with the very subjectivity of experience, that I do not think that such a communal account can really explain. I've never seen any convincing account.
Oh no, the audio cut off again.
So again, I mean, I think that the reductionistic, atomistic, summative account is wrong. I also think for the reason I just explained, I also think that the other extreme is wrong. I mean, one thing is to talk about the hive mind and collective consciousness. I think there are kind of metaphysical problems with even conceiving of something like that. I think the more communitarian perspective, I mean, the idea that a community is somehow a precondition or presupposition for individual subjectivity. I mean, I also think it's wrong if it's supposed to offer the full story. But I also think there's something right about that perspective. And I think what it basically forces us to do is to distinguish between different notions of individuality, different notions of selfhood. So I do think that there are certain notions of what it means to be a person. There are certain notions of what it means to be a self that is only available within a social network, which is only available together with others, which we could never obtain or achieve simply if we were solitary subjects. So I agree with that. And of course, I would also agree that in so many ways our lives are enriched and expanded as a result of our social interaction. But where I have a problem is with the idea that subjectivity itself, or the first person perspective itself, or what I would call the minimal self, that is something that is enabled and preconditioned by social interaction or social setting. I mean, I would find that I've never seen any plausible explanation of how sociality should be able to give rise to phenomenal consciousness with its entailed subjectivity. And moreover, I would also say that for the very notion of sociality to make sense, well, it needs intersubjectivity. It needs a relationship between subjects. It cannot conjure those subjects out of nowhere. I mean, I think whatever one would call that which precedes individual subjectivity, one should definitely not call it sociality, because sociality by definition requires that plurality of subjects, and so it can't explain or give rise to them.
Yes, brilliant. I mean, I would say perhaps there's like an overreaction to this to counter liberal individualism, where now we have this notion that there's no self, there's no non-dual perspectives. But of course, as you rightly mentioned, intersubjectivity cannot come ex nihilo. That's even like an absurd kind of statement. Professor Xavier, I've taken up too much of your time amidst all of the technical issues, but as I was saying, I've learned so much from your books, and thank you so much for humoring me with all my questions, but also just for the really informative interview.
No, I mean, thanks a lot. I mean, I really thought it was great questions. I mean, I have participated in various podcasts by now, and I have to say, I mean, there's also a huge difference in how the podcasts are conducted. And I have to say, when I saw the questions you wanted to ask me, I was completely calm, because I thought these are excellent questions, and I have very much enjoyed our conversation. So
thanks so much. And also, when you have the time, I would try to email you again for another interview, because as you saw, I have heaps more to ask.